Somewhere off the coast of Venezuela, 4.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas sits under the seabed. It belongs to Venezuela. It has almost nothing to do with the United States. And yet, over the past 3 years, that single gas field has helped trigger a chain of events that includes a revoked license, a reinstated license, warships docking in Port of Spain, a president captured in the middle of the night, and a $500 million American embassy now rising out of the ground in Trinidad and Tobago. Here's the question I want you to sit with for the next little while. If a gas field that isn't even Trinidad's can pull Washington this deep into the Caribbean, what happens when the resource in question actually does belong to a Caribbean nation? What happens when that resource sits inside the ground of a country like Jamaica? And the Pentagon itself has already said on the record that it can no longer live without it. That is not a hypothetical. That is already happening. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how Trinidad turned a shrinking, aging gas industry into one of the closest relationships Washington has anywhere in the English-speaking Caribbean, what that relationship has cost Trinidad along the way, and why Jamaica may be standing at the exact same crossroads right now, whether its own government realizes it or not. Let's start with the country most of this story runs through. And let's start with a number that tells you almost everything you need to know about Trinidad and Tobago's economy in one sentence. In 2022, oil and gas accounted for roughly 36% of everything Trinidad and Tobago's economy produced. Not a leading sector, not the biggest slice. 36% of the entire national output from a single industry. It gets more lopsided from there. That same year, energy made up 81% of everything Trinidad sold to the rest of the world, 81 cents of every export dollar, and 55% of the government's own revenue, the money that pays for schools, hospitals, roads, salaries, all of it, came from oil and gas as well. If you wanted to design a national economy that lives or dies by the price of a barrel of oil and the flow of a pipeline, you would be hard-pressed to build one more exposed than this. And Trinidad didn't just produce oil and gas, it built an entire industrial identity around it. This is the most industrialized economy in the English-speaking Caribbean. And it earned that title almost entirely through energy. Trinidad is Latin America's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It is the world's largest exporter of ammonia. It is one of the largest exporters of methanol anywhere on the planet. For a twin island nation with a population smaller than many mid-sized American cities, that is an extraordinary footprint to carry. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means Trinidad built something rare in the developing world. An economy that supplies raw fuel to its neighbors and refined industrial chemicals to the rest of the planet all at once from an island chain most of the world could not point to on a map. But here's the part of the story that explains everything that comes after it, the part that turns a national success story into a national emergency quietly over the course of a decade. Trinidad's oil and gas fields are old. They are not new discoveries. They are fields that have been pumped for generations, and production from them has been sliding in what economists call a secular decline. That phrase matters, so let's be precise about what it means. A secular decline isn't a bad year. It isn't a temporary dip you recover from once prices swing back in your favor. It is a slow, steady structural drain, the kind that happens when the easy gas has already been taken out of the ground, and what's left gets harder and more expensive to reach every single year. Now layer one more detail on top of that, because it's the detail that should genuinely stop you. Despite generating the overwhelming majority of the country's export earnings and government revenue, the energy sector employs only about 5% of Trinidad's workforce. Read that again if you need to. 5% of the people working in Trinidad and Tobago are holding up almost the entire weight of the national balance sheet, and the ground beneath their feet is running dry. Picture what that feels like from inside a government finance ministry. You are watching the industry that funds nearly everything you do slowly deplete itself year after year, and you know with total certainty that the day is coming when the math simply stops working. That is not a distant, abstract fear for Trinidad's leadership. That has been the defining pressure of the last decade, and it is a pressure that touches far more than budget spreadsheets. Every subsidized fuel price at the pump, every dollar spent on public health care, every scholarship program, every road repair in Trinidad and Tobago traces back, in one way or another, to energy revenue. When that revenue shrinks, the pressure doesn't stay contained inside a ministry building. It moves outward into households, into hospitals, into the daily lives of ordinary Trinidadians who may never think about liquefied natural gas exports, but who feel the consequences the moment those exports slow down. That is the exact pressure that sent Trinidad, looking just a few miles across open water, into waters that belong to Venezuela, toward a gas field with a name that is about to become very important to this story: Dragon. Before we get there, though, you need to understand exactly where Trinidad's gas actually goes once it comes out of the ground, because it shows you just how much of the country's future depends on keeping one single facility fed. Almost all of Trinidad's gas passes through one plant, Atlantic LNG, sitting at Point Fortin on the country's southwest coast. Shell owns just over 47% of it. BP owns just under 43%, and Trinidad's own national gas company holds the remaining 10%. At full capacity, this plant can produce 12 million tons of liquefied natural gas a year. In 2025, it produced roughly 9 million tons, well short of capacity. Not because the plant is broken, but because there simply isn't enough gas left flowing into it to run at full strength. One of its 4 production lines, Train 1, was mothballed back in 2020 because the gas supply could no longer justify keeping it switched on. That's the picture of a facility running on fumes, quite literally. And yet 2025 brought something Trinidad hadn't seen in years, a turnaround, however modest. Production climbed to just over 17.5 million cubic meters for the year, up from around 16.6 million the year before, a rise of nearly 6% and the plant's first annual increase since 2022. And here's where the story sharpens into something with real financial teeth. Following a contract restructuring finalized in late 2023, Trinidad started selling its LNG cargoes at premiums of between 15 and 55% above the benchmark price the rest of the industry uses to set gas prices globally. Every extra unit of gas Trinidad can find and pipe into that plant is now worth significantly more than it used to be. Hold on to that number, because it's the engine sitting quietly behind every diplomatic phone call, every handshake, every warship visit you're about to hear about. When a country is losing its main resource but discovers it can sell what's left for far more money than before, that country will do almost anything to secure more of that resource. And just across the water sat exactly what Trinidad needed. Dragon holds an estimated 4.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, a figure confirmed through seismic and well data gathered by Shell and Trinidad's own national gas company. For a country whose fields are drying up, that number sitting a short pipeline away isn't just an opportunity, it's close to a lifeline. The only catch, and it's a significant one, is that Dragon sits in Venezuelan waters, which means getting to it means dealing with Venezuela's state oil company, which means dealing with one of the most heavily sanctioned regimes on Earth. Trinidad and Venezuela actually signed their first agreement on this project back in 2018, a deal worth an estimated $1 billion. It stalled almost immediately. American sanctions on Venezuela were severe enough that any Trinidadian company doing business with PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, risked walking straight into those sanctions themselves. For years, Dragon sat there, fully mapped, fully understood, completely out of reach. This is where Washington enters the story for the first time, and where you start to see exactly how a small Caribbean nation learns to work a much larger power. In the middle of 2022, Trinidad went directly to the United States Treasury Department and asked for special permission to negotiate with PDVSA, sanctions or no sanctions. And their argument was carefully built for the moment. They framed it around regional energy security and around reducing dependence on Russian energy at a time when the war in Ukraine was reshaping how the entire world thought about where its gas came from. It worked. In January of 2023, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control granted Trinidad a 2-year license to negotiate and develop Dragon with PDVSA with one hard condition. No cash payments could go directly to the Venezuelan government, and Shell would operate the project. Trinidad's Prime Minister at the time, Keith Rowley, said publicly that the country hoped to eventually import 350 million cubic feet of gas a day through a pipeline running straight from Dragon. By September 21, 2023, Trinidad and Venezuela had formally signed their agreement for joint development of shared gas resources, Dragon included. Later that year, Washington amended the license again, this time allowing payments to Venezuela in hard currency or in kind, and extending the deadline out to October of 2025. For a while, everything kept moving forward. In July of 2024, Venezuela granted BP and Trinidad's national gas company a 20-year license for a related field called Coquina-Mannequin. By October, Shell had already begun preliminary survey work near Dragon itself. If you were watching from inside Trinidad's energy ministry at that moment, you would have believed the hardest part was behind you. The sanctions had been navigated, the agreements were signed, the surveys were underway, and then, on November 4, 2024, Donald Trump won the United States presidential election, and almost overnight, everything Trinidad had built became uncertain again. Trinidad moved fast. 2 days after the election, Prime Minister Keith Rowley wrote directly to Trump, describing the relationship between the two countries as, in his words, a long and enduring relationship founded on deep ties across trade, security, culture, and people-to-people exchanges, and said Trinidad looked forward to strengthening that cooperation in the years ahead. That is the language of a country trying to get ahead of a problem before it becomes one. It wasn't enough. In February 2025, Rowley told the room at Trinidad's own energy conference in Port of Spain that his government intended to engage directly with the new administration to protect the Dragon and Coquina-Mannequin projects. Nobody in that room knew how quickly that engagement was about to be tested. On February 26, 2025, Trump announced he was terminating a separate license that had allowed the American company Chevron to operate in Venezuela, a license originally granted under the Biden administration, calling it a reversal of what he described as concessions handed to Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro. If you were in Trinidad watching that announcement, you would have felt the ground shift. Because if Washington was willing to pull Chevron's license, a much larger American company with far more political weight than Dragon's license held by a much smaller country, was clearly not safe either. For a moment it seemed like Trinidad might dodge the blow. On March 25th and 26th, American officials said the United States remained committed to helping Trinidad's energy security despite concerns over Venezuela. Trinidad's Prime Minister at the time, Stuart Young, met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Jamaica for a 1-hour bilateral meeting around those same days. Reassuring words, a face-to-face meeting, everything that should have signaled the relationship was solid. None of it saved the license. On April 8, 2025, Young stood at a press briefing in Port of Spain and confirmed what Trinidad had been dreading. Washington had revoked the licenses for both Dragon and Coquina-Mannequin. His government, he told reporters, was in touch with attorneys in Washington and would continue pursuing every avenue available. Trinidad had until May 27, 2025, to wind down its involvement in both projects entirely, and Young's reaction in the moment stayed measured. He admitted the reversal didn't come as a total surprise, given how volatile Washington's policy toward Venezuela had already become, and given the tariff disputes running in parallel at the same time. For months, that seemed to be the end of it, a resource Trinidad desperately needed, fully agreed upon, now legally off-limits. And then, in October of 2025, the story turned again, and this time it turned because of one person. Trinidad had a new prime minister by then. Kamla Persad-Bissessar's party won the election on April 28, 2025, securing a 26-seat parliamentary majority. Secretary of State Marco Rubio praised her almost immediately, calling her a strong leader, a friend, and a United States ally who shared President Trump's priorities on security and immigration. That is not the kind of language Washington uses casually about a foreign head of government it barely knows, and the reversal that followed came fast. On October 9, 2025, Trinidad's Attorney General, John Jeremy, confirmed that a fresh license had been granted, restoring Trinidad and Shell's ability to resume negotiations with PDVSA over Dragon. This new license came in stages, with the first stage permitting negotiations through April of 2026, but with a new condition attached this time. American companies now had to be included in the development phase of the project itself. Trinidad's energy minister, Rudel Munalal, later said the country was now targeting the fourth quarter of 2027 for Dragon's first production at a rate of roughly 350 million cubic feet a day. So what actually changed? Why did a license that was dead in April come back to life by October? Part of the answer sits entirely in the relationship Persad-Bissessar built with Washington in the months in between, and that relationship deserves a much closer look, because it explains almost everything about why Trinidad, and not some other Caribbean nation, became this close to the United States. From the very start of her time in office, Persad Bissessar positioned herself as one of the most vocal supporters of U.S. policy anywhere in the Caribbean. In September of 2025, the United States carried out its first strike on an alleged drug boat that had departed from Venezuela, a strike President Trump said killed 11 people. The very next day, Persad Bissessar released a statement saying she, along with most of the country, was happy the United States naval deployment was having success in its mission, adding that she had no sympathy for traffickers and that the American military should, in her words, kill them all violently. That is a striking thing for any head of government to say publicly, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The United States kept expanding its military footprint in the southern Caribbean through the rest of 2025, and by October 26th, the American destroyer USS Gravely had docked in Port of Spain for several days of joint training exercises with Trinidad's own forces. Venezuela's foreign ministry condemned the exercises as dangerous, calling them a hostile provocation. 2 days later, on October 28th, Venezuela's National Assembly voted to declare Persad Bissessar persona non grata, banning her from entering the country entirely, a direct response to her support for the American military buildup. She didn't back down. She pushed back hard on any suggestion that Trinidad was being used as a staging ground for American operations, insisting the country was not susceptible to what she called blackmail from Venezuela over political support. Restricting illegal guns, drugs, and human trafficking, she argued, would reduce violence across the entire Caribbean, and especially in Trinidad, a country that has declared 2 separate states of emergency in recent years because of rising crime. Now, before we go further into where this alliance led, I want to pause here because if this story has grabbed you so far, and I think it has, this is exactly the kind of research most channels won't take the time to actually verify. We're closing in on 20,000 subscribers on this channel, and every one of you watching this, especially if you've been with us through the Jamaica documentaries, is part of how we get there. If you want more of this, the kind of Caribbean history and geopolitics coverage nobody else is putting this much work into, subscribing costs you nothing and it tells us exactly what to keep making. Now back to Trinidad, because what happens next is where this story stops being simple. Not every strike in this American campaign came without cost to Trinidad itself. And this is where the story gets harder to sit with, no matter which side of it you find yourself agreeing with. On October 14, 2025, a United States strike reportedly killed 2 people from Las Cuevas, a community in Trinidad and Tobago. By January of 2026, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and attorney Jonathan Haffetz had filed a federal lawsuit in the United States on behalf of the victims' families, alleging the strikes amounted to premeditated, intentional killings without any plausible legal justification. That lawsuit is still working its way through the courts as of this recording, and it is worth holding on to as we talk about the warmer side of this relationship, because both things are true at the same time. Trinidad has gained real diplomatic and economic benefits from its closeness to Washington, and that closeness has also produced real documented harm to Trinidadian citizens and a real legal dispute that has not been resolved. Then came the moment that changed everything, the single event that turned this from a regional story into a story the entire world was watching. On January 3, 2026, the United States military launched an operation in Caracas, Venezuela's capital, and captured President Nicolás Maduro, along with his wife, Celia Flores. More than 150 aircraft, alongside special forces from multiple branches of the American military, took part in the operation. President Trump announced that the United States would, in his own words, run the country until a safe, proper, and judicious transition of power could take place. Maduro and his wife were flown to New York, where they now face charges related to narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and weapons offenses. Think about the sheer logistics of a night like that. More than 150 aircraft, coordinated across multiple branches of the military, converging on a capital city, all aimed at extracting one man and his wife from the seat of power they had held for years. This was not a quiet diplomatic maneuver. This was one of the most visible uses of American military force in the Western Hemisphere in recent memory, and it happened less than a 2-hour flight from Trinidad's own coastline. The human cost of that night is still disputed, and it likely will be for a long time. Venezuela's Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, later claimed 100 people were killed and a similar number injured. Other reporting has placed the number of Venezuelan military dead somewhere between 23 and 47, alongside 32 Cuban personnel Cuba's government said were killed while carrying out missions on behalf of Venezuela's military. 7 American service members were injured, though none were killed, according to a Pentagon official. 2 days later, on January 5, Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in as interim president. A spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General called the operation a dangerous precedent, a view echoed publicly by legal scholars in multiple countries who have questioned whether the operation was lawful under international law. And here's where Prasad Bisesar's carefully built alliance with Washington took a turn nobody quite expected. Despite months of praising American military action in the region, she distanced Trinidad from this specific operation, issuing a statement making clear her government had not participated in it, and that Trinidad looked forward to renewed cooperation and a strengthened friendship with the people of Venezuela in the years ahead. A notably different tone from the language she'd used just months before, and a reminder that even the closest allies know exactly when to step back from an operation they can't publicly defend. A new government was in place in Caracas by February of 2026, and the United States responded by issuing fresh general licenses, restoring the pathway for BP and Shell to resume cross-border gas development with Venezuela, though payments now have to be routed through accounts controlled by the U.S. Treasury. Trinidad's energy minister confirmed the country was still targeting the fourth quarter of 2027 for Dragon's first gas. You don't need to look any further than Port of Spain itself for proof of how seriously the United States now takes this relationship. American construction crews have been breaking ground on a brand new U.S. embassy, built on 11 acres in Maraval, on the former grounds of the Trinidad Country Club, acquired back in 2023. When the project was first announced, American officials said it would cost more than $400 million. By March of 2026, that figure had grown, with the U.S. Embassy confirming it would now invest more than $500 million to plan, design, and build the new compound, with a finish date targeted for 2029. An American chargé d'affaires described the project as, in her words, a powerful reflection of the robust and long-standing relationship between the people and governments of both countries. Diplomatic ties between the two nations trace back to August 31, 1962, the very day Trinidad and Tobago became independent, and the relationship has stayed active at the highest levels ever since. In November of 2025, the chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Don Kane, visited Trinidad and met personally with Prime Minister Prasad Bisesar. $500 million for an embassy is not pocket change, and it is not the kind of investment any country makes casually. It signals long-term intent. It tells you exactly how central Trinidad has become to America's strategy in the Southern Caribbean, a strategy built around energy, around security cooperation, and around countering both Venezuela and the drug trafficking routes running through these waters. But none of this alignment has come without friction inside Trinidad itself, and it would not be an honest telling of this story to leave that part out. Prasad Bisesar's closeness to Washington has been described in reporting inside Trinidad as sparking accusations that the country is behaving like what critics call a vassal state, fueling fierce domestic political opposition. Her government's alignment with the United States has also strained Trinidad's relationships within the wider Caribbean community, CARICOM, with reporting suggesting she has alienated regional colleagues by breaking so publicly with the more cautious, non-interventionist approach most CARICOM governments have historically taken toward Washington's actions against Venezuela. This is not a simple story of a small country winning big from a powerful friend. It is a story of trade-offs, and every one of you watching this, whether you're in Kingston, in Port of Spain, in London, or in Toronto, should walk away understanding one thing clearly. Closeness to any major power always comes with strings attached, and often with a price that isn't immediately visible from the outside. Think about what Trinidad actually gave up to get here. A prime minister willing to publicly endorse lethal force against alleged traffickers before all the facts were even known. A relationship with Venezuela so damaged that its own head of government was formally barred from ever setting foot there. A rift with CARICOM neighbors who built their entire regional identity around staying out of exactly these kinds of confrontations. None of that shows up in a press release about a new embassy or a restored gas license. But all of it is part of the price Trinidad paid, and it is worth naming plainly, because the next country that walks this same path, whichever country that ends up being, will face the same choice. To be fair to both sides of this relationship, Trinidad's government and the United States government are, on the whole, describing this partnership in overwhelmingly positive terms. American officials have repeatedly used the language of partnership, calling Trinidad a long-standing, robust ally in the Caribbean, a country the U.S. remains committed to supporting. American diplomats nominated to serve in Port of Spain have spoken about strengthening security, trade, and energy cooperation, while also acknowledging, during confirmation hearings, that Trinidad's repeated states of emergency and its history with extremist recruitment remain genuine areas of concern that Washington is watching closely. None of that erases the lawsuit filed on behalf of the Las Cuevas families. None of it settles the question of whether every strike carried out under this campaign was lawful. Both sides of this story belong to the same relationship, and they deserve to be weighed together, not separately. So now we arrive at the question this entire video was built to answer. What does any of this have to do with Jamaica? Jamaica does not have Trinidad's oil and gas. That is the honest starting point, and there's no getting around it. Jamaica is in fact the near opposite of an energy exporter. As of 2021, roughly 64% of Jamaica's entire energy matrix depended on imported petroleum, according to research compiled from the country's own government data. Jamaica's own energy ministry has separately described petroleum imports as accounting for an even higher share of overall energy usage, depending on how you measure it. But the underlying reality doesn't change no matter which figure you use. Jamaica has to buy its energy from abroad, and that leaves the country exposed every single time global oil and gas prices move. That exposure wasn't theoretical. It played out in real time in 2026. When a Middle East-driven fuel crisis pushed Brent crude oil from somewhere around $78 to $82 a barrel up to roughly $115 a barrel, while natural gas prices tied to the Henry Hub benchmark climbed from around $2.19 to about $4.48. Around 6% of Jamaica's entire economic output typically comes from energy imports, which means a price spike like that doesn't stay contained to gas stations. It ripples through nearly every part of Jamaican life, from the cost of electricity, to the cost of running the buses that get people to work in the morning, to the cost of keeping hotels air-conditioned for the tourists the entire economy leans on. And unlike Trinidad, Jamaica has no domestic gas field to fall back on when prices spike. There is no Point Fortin sitting on Jamaican soil, no national gas company that can simply pump more supply when the global market turns unfriendly. When oil climbs, Jamaica absorbs the shock directly, dollar for dollar, with nothing standing between the world price and the Jamaican consumer's monthly bill. Jamaica has been trying to reduce this exposure for years, with real but slow results. Renewable sources made up about 13% of Jamaica's electricity generation as of 2020. Wind contributing roughly 9%, solar around 3%. The government's original Vision 2030 energy policy set a target of 30% renewable electricity by 2030. Then Prime Minister Andrew Holness raised that ambition in 2018 to 50%. Progress has been real, but it has also been slow, and Jamaica remains, at its core, an energy importer, sitting in a world where energy exporters like Trinidad are the ones building half-billion-dollar relationships with Washington. Here is the part of this story that most people, even people who follow Jamaican news closely, are missing entirely. Because while Jamaica has no oil, it has something else the United States government has just decided is strategically critical, and the parallels to Trinidad's story sit far closer than you might expect. On January 11, 2026, the United States Department of Defense announced a strategic partnership worth $450 million with a company called the Atlantic Alumina Company, known as Atalco. Atalco operates a refinery in Gramercy, Louisiana, and here is the detail that changes everything for Jamaica. That refinery is the only operating alumina refinery left in the entire United States, and it runs almost entirely on bauxite imported from one single place, the island of Jamaica. Let that sit for a moment, because it's easy to say quickly and miss how significant it actually is. The Pentagon just spent $450 million protecting America's last alumina refinery, and that refinery's survival depends almost completely on ore coming out of the Jamaican ground. This is not a distant supply chain running through some country Washington barely thinks about. This is a direct physical dependency, a factory on American soil in Louisiana that simply cannot function without a steady flow of Jamaican bauxite crossing the Caribbean Sea. That is a form of leverage most countries spend decades trying to build, and Jamaica already has it, sitting quietly in the ground, whether anyone in Kingston has fully reckoned with that yet or not. The financial structure of that deal breaks down like this. $150 million comes as preferred equity, contributed directly by the Pentagon through Atalco. More than $300 million comes from a company called Concord Resources, a subsidiary of Pinnacle Asset Management, which also holds a commercial stake in Jamaica's own bauxite supply chain. Keeping the Gramercy refinery running is the stated purpose, alongside building a brand new gallium recovery circuit, because right now the United States has zero domestic gallium production. Gallium ranks as a critical mineral used in defense and advanced manufacturing applications, everything from radar systems to semiconductors. The target for that new circuit is 50 metric tons of gallium a year, an amount Atalco says would be enough to cover the entire American demand for the metal. Low silica content and alumina availability above 46% are what make Jamaican bauxite especially valuable for this purpose. But the story doesn't stop at gallium. The Gramercy site also holds around 30 million tons of accumulated bauxite residue, material that's been building up for decades, and that residue reportedly contains at least 15 of the 46 strategic materials designated by the U.S. Defense Logistics Agency, including 10 of the 17 elements classified as rare earths, at concentrations roughly 25 times higher than what's normally found in the Earth's crust. A separate company, Element USA, is now building an $850 million rare earth processing facility right next to the Atalco refinery, backed by a $29.9 million grant from the Department of Defense, built specifically to extract these materials from Jamaican bauxite residue. Zoom out and the scale becomes even clearer. Since 2025, the United States government's total direct investment in critical mineral projects sits at approximately $2.3 billion, and a meaningful share of that money now runs directly through Jamaican bauxite. On the ground in Jamaica, this entire supply chain is anchored by Jamaica Bauxite Mining Limited. This state entity holds a 51% interest in an operation called Discovery Bauxite Partners, working in the parish of St. Anne alongside Concord Resources, the same company backing the Pentagon's investment in Louisiana. Jamaica's Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining issued a public statement acknowledging the Atalco-Concord partnership, describing it as reflecting growing global demand for alumina and critical minerals vital to aerospace, defense, advanced manufacturing, energy technology, and semiconductors. There's a second Jamaican supply chain worth understanding here too. Jamalco, a major alumina operation majority owned by the American company Century Aluminum since 2023, has seen its shipments to American buyers grow sharply, and this is where the numbers really jump. Jamaican alumina shipments to the United States reached 223,000 tons in 2025, up from 107,000 tons the year before. That's an increase of more than 100% in a single year. Jamaica's overall alumina output reached about 1.34 million tons in 2024, up from roughly 1.29 million tons in 2023. And alumina export earnings for just the first 9 months of 2025 came to around 447 million United States dollars. To understand why any of this matters this much to Washington, you have to understand what's happened to America's own aluminum industry, because the collapse is almost hard to believe. More than 60% of global aluminum production capacity now sits under China's control. The United States, meanwhile, has been reduced to just 4 operating smelters, producing under 700,000 tons in 2025. Compare that to 1980. When 33 American smelters were producing 4.65 million tons. That is the scale of the collapse in America's own domestic capacity, and it is exactly why a small Caribbean island's bauxite has suddenly become part of United States national defense planning. Now put these two stories side by side, because the comparison is the entire reason we made this video. Trinidad took a resource that was running out, a shrinking, aging oil and gas industry, and turned it into deep, formal engagement with the United States government. Diplomatic visits from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, naval exercises with American destroyers, a license to develop a gas field, revoked once and then restored, a $500 million embassy now under construction in Port of Spain. All of it grew out of a government that decided to actively align itself with Washington's priorities, even when that alignment carried real domestic and regional costs. Jamaica is sitting on a resource that has just become newly relevant to Washington for entirely different reasons. This is not a declining resource that needs saving. This is bauxite and the critical minerals inside it that the Pentagon has decided it cannot afford to live without. The numbers back this up clearly. Well over $1.2 billion is what the combined Atalco and Element USA investments alone total, flowing into a supply chain that runs directly through St. Ann, Jamaica. And yet, based on everything documented so far, a single acknowledgement statement from Jamaica's Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining is the extent of the country's public response to any of this. There is no evidence, at least not yet, of the kind of coordinated national strategy Trinidad built around its own resource, no diplomatic offensive, no formal negotiating position, no public roadmap. One Jamaican newspaper editorial, published in February of 2026, put it directly, calling on the government to develop what it described as a comprehensive roadmap, a national mineral strategy to actually take advantage of this moment before it passes. Compare that, for a second, to how deliberately Trinidad moved once it understood what was at stake. A letter to the incoming president within 48 hours of an election result. A prime minister personally attending an energy conference to explain the strategy to industry leaders. A foreign minister meeting face-to-face with the American Secretary of State. Attorneys in Washington retained and working the moment a license got pulled. That is what an active national strategy actually looks like in practice. Not a single statement from a ministry acknowledging that something important is happening in St. Ann. Jamaica has, by every account so far, been a spectator to a deal being built around its own natural resource, negotiated primarily between American companies and American government agencies, with Kingston reading about the details after the fact rather than shaping them beforehand. So here's what I want to leave you with, and here's the question I genuinely want you to answer in the comments below, because I think it matters more than almost anything else we've covered in this video. Trinidad shows us what it looks like when a Caribbean nation decides to actively shape its relationship with a major power, for better and for worse, with every risk and every benefit that comes attached to that decision. Jamaica now has its own version of that same opportunity, sitting quietly in the ground in St. Ann. And the difference between what happens next in Kingston and what has already happened in Port of Spain may come down to a single question. Should Jamaica be negotiating from strength right now the way Trinidad eventually learned to, treating its bauxite as a strategic asset to be actively managed and leveraged? Or does the cost of that kind of closeness with Washington, the domestic backlash, the regional strain, the moral weight of what happened at Las Cuevas, outweigh whatever economic benefit comes with it? I want to know where you land, and I want to know why, because this isn't a question with an obvious answer, and the people who will actually decide it are watching this channel right now. This video set out to answer one question. Why is the United States suddenly so interested in Trinidad's oil, and what could Jamaica possibly learn from it? The answer, as we've seen, has nothing to do with luck and everything to do with strategy. Trinidad's gas fields are running dry. Its flagship export plant at Point Fortin has spent years running below capacity. And yet its government, read the geopolitical moment correctly, aligned itself with Washington's priorities in the Caribbean and turned that alignment into real, tangible investment, even when it meant taking political risk at home and tension with its neighbors abroad. A license revoked in April of 2025 was back on the table by October of that same year. A $500 million embassy is now rising out of the ground in Port of Spain as a direct result of that relationship. Jamaica does not have oil, and it never will. But it has bauxite, and inside that bauxite sits gallium and rare earth elements the United States now considers essential to its own national defense, backed by well over $1 billion in Pentagon-linked investment already flowing into St. Anne. Trinidad has already shown what happens when a small Caribbean nation decides to actively manage that kind of leverage for all the benefits and all the costs that come with it. The next chapter of this story, whether Jamaica does the same with what it has not been written yet. What happens next is up to the people who will decide it, in Kingston and nowhere else. If this video helped you see something about the region you didn't see before, subscribing genuinely helps us keep making this kind of work, and we're closer than ever to 20,000 of you doing exactly that. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. We'll see you in the next one.